the child that we decided, life was going to come to an end at some point.
The Ronettes became one of the biggest girl groups of the 1960s, creating timeless hits and touring with the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. At the height of their success, everything suddenly fell apart, not because of fading talent, but because of one man's obsession. This is the remarkable rise, heartbreaking fall, and lasting legacy of the Ronettes. Chapter 1. 3 Girls from Washington Heights. Before the fame, the hit records, and the screaming fans, there were simply 3 young girls singing together on a rooftop in Washington Heights, Manhattan. The trio was made up of sisters Estelle Bennett and Veronica Ronnie Bennett, along with their cousin Nedra Talley. Music was not a carefully planned career choice. It was something they loved. Whenever they could, the girls escaped to the rooftop of their apartment building, where they practiced their harmonies away from the noise of everyday life. Growing up in Washington Heights exposed them to a rich mix of cultures and sounds. The neighborhood brought together African American, Puerto Rican, Caribbean, Irish, and Cherokee influences, creating a musical environment that quietly shaped their voices. They absorbed everything around them, from street rhythms to the songs playing on the radio. Their biggest inspirations included Frankie Lyman and the Teenagers, Little Anthony and the Imperials, and Rosemary Clooney. For Ronnie, hearing Frankie Lyman was a life-changing moment. She realized that singing was not just a hobby, it could become her future. The first person to recognize their potential was their grandmother. Every Saturday night, she encouraged the girls to perform together at family gatherings. Those small performances slowly became serious rehearsals, and soon everyone noticed something special. Their voices blended perfectly. Ronnie stood out from the beginning. Her voice carried a rare combination of innocence and strength. She could sound delicate and emotional one moment, then powerful and unforgettable the next. In 1959, the girls became known as the Darling Sisters and entered the famous amateur night competition at the Apollo Theater. Despite being teenagers, their confidence impressed the audience, and they won. That victory opened new doors. They began performing at clubs, dances, and local events around New York City. They were gaining valuable stage experience and building a reputation. Then, in 1961, an unbelievable opportunity appeared. While waiting outside the famous Peppermint Lounge, the girls were mistaken for a missing singing group. Instead of correcting the mistake, they walked inside and performed Ray Charles's What I Say. The crowd loved them. That accidental performance turned them into regular performers at the club. Soon, they were appearing at major venues like the Brooklyn Fox Theater and attracting attention from record labels. But success was still out of reach. They needed the right song, the right opportunity, and the right person to guide them. That person would be producer Phil Spector, the man who would change their lives forever. Chapter 2. Phil Spector and the Birth of a Classic. By early 1963, the Ronettes had become one of New York's most promising young vocal groups. They had performed in clubs, released several singles, and worked as background singers for other artists. But despite their talent and determination, they were still waiting for the opportunity that would transform them from local performers into international stars. That moment arrived when they met a 23-year-old producer named Phil Spector. Spector was already changing the sound of pop music. His famous wall of sound technique turned simple songs into massive musical experiences by combining layers of guitars, pianos, strings, brass, drums, and powerful echoes. His recordings sounded bigger, more dramatic, and unlike anything else on the radio. The exact story of how Spector discovered the Ronettes remains uncertain. Some believe Estelle Bennett accidentally contacted him while trying to arrange a recording session, while others say the group was introduced through a magazine connection. But one fact remains clear. The moment Spector heard Ronnie Bennett's voice, he knew he had found something special. He originally wanted Ronnie as a solo artist, but her mother insisted that if Ronnie was signed, Estelle and Nedra had to be included too. Spector agreed, and in March 1963, the Ronettes officially joined Phil's records. Spector did more than produce their music. He created a new identity for them. Their huge hairstyles, dark eyeliner, stylish dresses, and confident attitude separated them from the innocent image of many girl groups of the era. They looked bold, fearless, and unforgettable. Inside Hollywood's legendary Gold Star Studios, Spector began creating what he believed would become a timeless record. He brought together elite session musicians known as the Wrecking Crew, building an enormous wall of sound around Ronnie's voice. The result was Be My Baby. Released in August 1963, The song became an instant sensation. Ronnie's emotional vocals combined with the unforgettable drum opening created one of the most iconic recordings in music history. The song reached number 2 on the Billboard Hot 100 and influenced countless musicians, including Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys. Suddenly, the Ronettes were no longer just a New York group. They were international stars. But behind the success was a partnership that would soon become much more complicated. Chapter 3: The Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and the Peak of Fame. By the end of 1963, the Ronettes had become one of America's biggest new sensations. Be My Baby had transformed them from a New York girl group into international stars. Ronnie Bennett's powerful, emotional voice and the trio's fearless style captured the attention of audiences everywhere. For 3 girls who once practiced on a rooftop in Washington Heights, their dreams had become reality. Their success soon took them across the Atlantic. In early 1964, the Ronettes traveled to the United Kingdom for a concert tour. At the time, Beatlemania was beginning to explode, but the Ronettes arrived as the main attraction. One of the opening acts on their tour was a young British band still searching for fame, the future legends known as the Rolling Stones. The 2 groups traveled together from city to city, sharing long drives and unforgettable moments. Ronnie later remembered how thick English fog sometimes stopped their tour van completely. During one delay, she and Keith Richards walked through nearby neighborhoods, knocking on doors and asking strangers for tea while they waited for the weather to improve. It was a simpler era when future rock icons traveled together, built friendships, and experienced the same struggles as everyone else. The Ronettes quickly became a sensation in Britain. Their fashion, confidence, and stage presence made them different from any female group audiences had seen before. Soon, they caught the attention of another rising band, the Beatles. When the Ronettes met John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr at a London party, the connection was immediate. The Beatles admired their music, and Ronnie later recalled how natural the friendship felt. When the Beatles arrived in America for their legendary appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show, the Ronettes welcomed them at the airport. John Lennon jokingly suggested that Veronica Bennett should become Ronnie Spector, a name that matched her unforgettable voice and image. The name remained with her forever. Back home, the Ronettes continued releasing successful songs, including The Best Part of Breaking Up, Do I Love You, and Walking in the Rain. The latter became one of their greatest recordings, with Ronnie delivering a breathtaking vocal performance, surrounded by Phil Spector's dramatic production. By 1965, the Ronettes had reached the highest point of their career. They were international favorites, standing among the most popular groups in the world. But behind the fame, a dangerous change was happening. Phil Spector was no longer only their producer. He had become Ronnie's manager and romantic partner. The lines between business and personal life were disappearing, and slowly, the same man who helped create their success would begin controlling their future. Chapter 4: The Beginning of the End. At the height of their fame, the Ronettes appeared to have everything an artist could want. They had hit records, international tours, and the admiration of musicians who would become legends. To the public, they looked unstoppable, but behind the scenes, the foundation of the group was beginning to crack. The biggest problem wasn't changing musical tastes. It wasn't competition from newer bands. It was Phil Spector. By 1965, Spector wasn't simply producing the Ronettes anymore. He controlled nearly every aspect of their careers. He was their producer, their manager, and increasingly, Ronnie Bennett's romantic partner. Those roles became impossible to separate, giving him enormous influence over both their professional and personal lives. As his obsession with Ronnie grew, his attention to the group began to fade. Instead of focusing on the Ronettes, Spector poured his energy into other artists. He produced the Righteous Brothers' You've Lost That Lovin' Feelin', a song that became one of the biggest hits of the decade. Soon after, he invested enormous time and money into Ike and Tina Turner's River Deep, Mountain High, believing it would become his greatest masterpiece. The Ronettes, once the center of his musical empire, were quietly pushed aside. The effects were immediate. Songs the trio had already recorded remained locked away in the studio instead of being released. Other songs originally intended for them were handed to different artists. One of the biggest examples was Chapel of Love. The song had been prepared with the Ronettes in mind, but Spector eventually gave it to the Dixie Cups instead. It became a #1 hit. It was a painful reminder of what the Ronettes were losing. When new Ronettes singles finally appeared, they received far less promotion than earlier releases. Songs like Born to Be Together and Is This What I Get for Loving You showed that Ronnie's voice remained as powerful as ever. But without Spector's full support, they struggled to climb the charts. For the first time since signing with Phillies Records, the group's momentum had slowed dramatically. Then came one of the greatest opportunities of their entire career. In 1966, the Beatles announced what would become their final American tour. They personally requested the Ronettes as their opening act. It was an extraordinary honor. Opening for the biggest band in the world on their final tour would have introduced the Ronettes to millions of new fans and perhaps restarted their fading career. But Phil Spector refused. He would not allow Ronnie to go. Instead, he kept her at home and replaced her with her cousin Elaine, who joined Estelle and Nedra for the tour. The Beatles' audiences saw the Ronettes, but they didn't see Ronnie. Years later, Ronnie admitted that losing that opportunity broke her heart. She remembered how happy she had been touring with artists like the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and the Kinks, and how suddenly all of it disappeared. It was one of the defining moments of her life. The woman whose voice had made the Ronettes famous was no longer allowed to perform with her own group. By late 1966, the end was impossible to ignore. Their final single for Phil's Records, I Can Hear Music, wasn't even produced by Phil Spector. Instead, producer Jeff Barry took over as Spector gradually stepped away from the project. The song barely reached the Billboard Hot 100. The magic was gone. Not because Ronnie had stopped singing beautifully, not because Estelle and Nedra had lost their harmonies. The support system that had once driven their success had simply disappeared. Soon afterward, Phillies Records itself began shutting down. Without a label, without momentum, and without the producer who had once championed them, the group had little reason to continue. Following a tour of West Germany in early 1967, the three women made the difficult decision to go their separate ways. After less than 4 years together on Phil's Records, one of the greatest girl groups in music history was over. Each member tried to begin a new chapter. Nedra married Scott Ross and gradually stepped away from the music industry. Estelle settled into family life. Ronnie made the decision that would shape the rest of her life. In 1968, she married Phil Spector. To many fans, it seemed like a fairy tale ending. In reality, it marked the beginning of the darkest chapter she would ever experience. Chapter 5. A Prison Behind Mansion Walls. To the outside world, Ronnie Bennett had married the man who had made her a star. Fans saw a glamorous couple living in a luxurious California mansion. They assumed Ronnie had found happiness after years of success with the Ronettes. The reality was the complete opposite. According to Ronnie's autobiography, the marriage quickly became a nightmare. Phil Spector's possessiveness, which had already damaged her career, now consumed every part of her personal life. The mansion where they lived looked impressive from the outside, but Ronnie later described it as a prison. The property was surrounded by high fences topped with barbed wire. Guard dogs roamed the grounds. Visitors were carefully controlled, and Ronnie was rarely allowed to leave the house alone. When she did leave, Spector reportedly insisted she drive with an inflatable doll sitting in the passenger seat, so it would appear he was with her. It was only one example of his obsessive need to control her every movement. He hid her shoes to make escaping more difficult. He discouraged friendships. He prevented her from performing publicly and made it nearly impossible for her to record new music. The woman whose voice had once captivated millions was now trapped in silence. Occasionally, Spector allowed Ronnie back into a recording studio. In 1969, she recorded You Came, You Saw, You Conquered under the Ronettes name, but by then the musical landscape had changed dramatically. The era of girl groups had faded. Rock music was evolving rapidly, led by artists like Janis Joplin, Grace Slick, and countless new bands defining the late 1960s. The single failed to chart. It became painfully clear that the momentum the Ronettes had once enjoyed was gone. By 1972, Ronnie had reached her breaking point. She escaped the mansion barefoot, running through a broken glass door to reclaim her freedom. Leaving Phil Spector meant leaving behind nearly everything she had built. As part of the divorce settlement, she signed away future royalties from many of her biggest recordings. Ronnie later claimed she had done so because she feared for her safety. When the marriage ended, she walked away with almost nothing except her determination to rebuild her life. While Ronnie struggled to begin again, the other Ronettes quietly disappeared from public life. Nedra Talley married soon after the group ended and chose a far different path. She devoted herself to Christian music and religious work, eventually settling into a quiet life away from the spotlight. Estelle Bennett's story was far more heartbreaking. Once considered the most academically gifted member of the trio, she found it difficult to adjust after the Ronettes dissolved. Friends recalled that losing the group left an emptiness she never fully overcame. Over the years, Estelle battled severe mental illness and anorexia. At times, she experienced homelessness, wandering the streets of New York while telling strangers that the Ronettes would soon be performing nearby. It was a tragic contrast to the confident young woman who had once stood on stages before thousands of screaming fans. In 2007, the Ronettes were finally inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Keith Richards delivered the induction speech, praising the group for creating timeless music that had inspired generations of artists. Ronnie and Nedra performed together once more. Estelle attended the ceremony but did not sing. For one evening, the three women who had once changed popular music stood together again. 2 years later, Estelle Bennett passed away from colon cancer at the age of 67. For many fans, it felt like the closing of one of rock and roll's most bittersweet stories.
They may be gone, but their music lives on forever.